Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Noel M. Estwick, and I'm a research scientist with the Social Systems and Allied Research Group in the Cooperative Agricultural Research Center at Prairie View A&M University in Texas. I currently serve on the Extension Disaster Education Network, or EDEN's, Professional Development Committee. Please take a moment to type your name and institution in the chat box so we know who is with us today. Our presentation today is entitled Disaster Financial Preparedness Strategies, and our speakers will be Sarah Kroijmans and Lori Hendrickson. Just a little housekeeping before we get started with introductions. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box in your Zoom control window. I'll bring them up at the end of the presentation. I would also like to note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available in the coming days. I have included a link in the chat box for the webinar evaluation survey. Please take a moment to complete the evaluation at the conclusion of the webinar. Now, without any further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenters. Our presenters today are Sarah Kroijmans and Lori Hendrickson. Both are extension educators and extension professors with the University of Minnesota Extension Center for Family Development. Sarah received her BS degree from South Dakota State University and M.Ed. from the University of Minnesota. Sarah is committed to assisting individuals develop critical life skills and financial capability. She has taught youth, adults, teachers, and community agency staff on a variety of topics, including youth and money, decision-making, tenant education, learning styles, and disaster financial preparedness and recovery. As an accredited financial counselor through the Association for Financial Counseling and Planning Education, Sarah has financial and counsel experience with disaster survivors, gamblers, and military service members and their families. Lori holds a BS in Home Economics Education and an M.Ed., both from the University of Minnesota-Duluth. Lori's work enhances the financial capability of individuals and their families, positively impacting financial security throughout life. Lori is an accredited financial counselor through the Association for Financial Counseling, Planning, and Education. As part of her disaster recovery work, Lori led the development and impact evaluation of the NIFA-funded Financial Recovery After Disaster video series. Sarah will kick things off for us today.
Thank you, Noel, and thank you, Abby, as well. Lori and I are really pleased and excited to be here to share information and resources with folks. And so we're going to go ahead and get started here. There's a quick photo of us. Oftentimes when folks think about disaster preparedness, they think about putting together that emergency kit, you know, some water and clothing, and maybe even making a plan on where they're going to connect with family members if they have to evacuate. But it's really important to go beyond just that emergency kit and taking a look at folks' finances and doing some work to prepare financially. Throughout this webinar, we want you as participants to be engaged. And so this is the first of several questions that we're going to have throughout the webinar. So in the chat box, please share what are some of the potential disasters your communities may experience. So go ahead and type that in, sharing your responses with everyone. I know across the nation, we experience different types of disasters based on where we are geographically. So thank you, Dwayne. So we've got flooding, tornadoes, wind, earthquakes, wildfires for sure, hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding, tropical storms, and the hurricanes, flash flooding. Tornadoes and flooding get a lot of screen time there. Fires, oh, traffic. Sheila, tell me a little bit about traffic disasters. Straight line winds, drought, right, on the opposite end of flooding. So a lot of those. Thank you, Trinity, in Illinois, tornadoes, flooding, weather affecting agricultural communities. Thank you, Rob. Different disasters impact different communities in different ways. Here is a listing of possible disasters, and you hit on a lot of those. And again, different types of disasters impact individuals, families, the agricultural sector, small business owners, definitely in different ways. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, so NOAA, the National Centers for Environment Information, in 2018 there were 14 weather and climate disaster events with losses exceeding $1 billion each across the U.S. These events included 1 drought event, 8 severe storm events, 2 tropical cyclones, 1 wildfire event, and 2 winter storms. This map shows the approximate location for each of the 14 separate billion-dollar weather and climate disasters that impacted the U.S. during 2018. And during 2018, the U.S. experienced definitely an active year of billion-dollar disasters, including the 4th highest total number of events, only behind the years 2017, 16, and 2011. Also in 2018, the U.S. experienced the 4th highest total costs, so $91 billion in costs related to these events. And again, that was only behind the years 2017, 2012, and 2005. So 4 in 10 adults, if faced with an unexpected expense of $400, would either not be able to cover it or would cover it by selling something or borrowing money. Now, this is from the report on economic well-being of U.S. households in 2017. And this is an improvement from half of adults in 2013 being ill-prepared for such an expense. But if 4 in 10 are unable to come up with $400, a disaster we know is going to cost much more than that, and that throws families and individuals into crisis. Another statistic is that 78% of U.S. workers live from paycheck to paycheck to make ends meet. And so that really means they don't have dollars set aside to recover from a disaster. So let's take a look at some benefits of being financially prepared. Definitely, if folks have their finances in order, it can help reduce fear and anxiety and help folks have peace of mind. Helps protect oneself and their families. It helps folks be better prepared to navigate the recovery process, and those that are financially prepared will have more options available during the recovery process following a disaster. Now I'm going to pass this on to Lori here.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And Sarah, you can move my slides along for me. I'd appreciate that. All right, so we are going to share with you today some findings from a focus group study that we've been working on in the past 9 months or so. And part of this was related to disaster professionals, volunteers, and survivors. And we had conducted these groups last fall. And we wanted to explore the needs around being financially prepared for disaster. Now, we have a question here for you. This was one of the questions that we asked of our participants. How can people financially protect themselves from the impact of disaster? And so if you would respond in the chat pod and share with everyone, I'd appreciate that. And we're going to take a look at some of the answers that people provided us, and also some of the strategies along the way that we were able to develop as a result of, or identify as a result of, these focus groups. And so thank you. I'm seeing insurance and savings, family support, 6 months of an emergency fund if possible, emergency food supplies. Yes, certainly all ways that people can protect themselves financially. Being prepared by saving over time and having insurance. Knowing what government agencies exist to support recovery. All right. Wonderful. Thank you for those. And then moving on to our next slide. This is a little bit of an outline of what we did with our focus groups, and want to just share with you. You will see our timeline of our focus groups and the states from which our participants came. And so this happened last fall 2018, and we held 4 focus groups. They were done online. And our goal was to determine the need for financial preparedness resources. And we had 27 participants involved in these 5 groups actually. We had a pilot study as well. So our participants came from lists of previous participants from workshops, webinars, conferences, our listservs that we had. And so we had identified those individuals, asked them to participate in these focus groups. We had 66 individuals who RSVP'd, and then resulting in 27 who actually participated. Again, you see there the states that our participants came from depicted on the slide. Next slide, please, Sarah. So with our focus groups, we had a series of questions, first of all, that we asked our participants, asking, first of all, to think back to the last disaster that they responded to or were impacted by, and what financial issues were survivors better able to deal with and why. And you see here the strategies that people identified that were important. So having cash available was one piece. Why? Because there may be lack of access to banks and ATMs. They also needed to be able to communicate and relate with banks. And so one category we had here was having cash available. Another one was insurance as the first line of defense. Those with adequate insurance were able to recover faster. Insurance was seen as that first line of defense, and having or not having insurance made a difference. And also if an individual was underinsured, made a difference as well. Also understanding that coverage, somebody had mentioned that in the previous question when we asked you to respond. Understanding your coverage. Another piece of that was a relationship with the agent. Also, disaster survivors who had important papers organized and a household inventory completed prior to a disaster were better able to traverse the recovery process in disaster. So those important papers were organized. There might have been a household inventory, organized and replaced important papers as they were able to or as they needed to. Disaster survivors who had important papers organized and a household inventory, again, were seen as better able to navigate this process. Individuals and families who were financially stable prior to a disaster seemed to have more options to them, available to them, and were more resilient. They may have experienced less stress following a disaster because there were options available. And so financial stability prior to disaster can influence having an emergency fund to withstand the interruptions of income. It might also mean the ability to cover medical bills due to injuries, the ability to cover necessary travel or evacuation, the ability to replace or repair lost housing, and having a relationship with the financial institution that allowed them some options. Individuals who were informed and skilled in identifying and accessing recovery services were also better able to navigate the process. It also provided a sense of empowerment to build confidence to effectively reach one's goals. And individuals with prior disaster experience also could benefit by applying these learnings to their current situation. And so that previous experience with disaster made a difference as well. They may have had an understanding of the resources available and how to access them, and communication skills to then feel empowered and to be able to act were important there. And so also the type of disaster was another piece. And so, of course, dependent on the type of disaster that you were experiencing, the influences would be different for each. Next slide, please. We also asked, in relation to that idea of thinking back to the last disaster that you were involved with, what financial, oh, excuse me, I jumped ahead. We also asked what financial issues were more challenging for survivors. And so people identified that disaster recovery processes involve a lot of red tape. So survivors often have to be tenacious as self-advocates in their quest to find the needed assistance. Individuals with no or inadequate insurance were often faced with more challenges, and that might have been a situation of those without insurance or with limited insurance did not have the resources to complete the recovery process, and in some cases people identified individuals that they were aware of that had not yet fully recovered. We know that insurance is a complicated issue and many are underinsured and may not even recognize that fact. And so not having sufficient insurance to cover the cost of rebuilding can be a problem as well. Individuals who did not have important papers organized with their contact information felt overwhelmed and faced challenges during the recovery process. Being able to communicate, have that contact information for financial services, to be able to go ahead and get those replacement documents if needed, and communicate with insurance companies. And so if you did not have those items in place, those contacts in place, people felt overwhelmed. And it is also difficult to often recreate or replace some of those records if they are not organized and put aside. So individuals that lacked savings and resources are often less resilient and face greater financial challenges during the recovery phase. Next slide, please. Again, we asked to think back to that situation that you were last involved in, and what financial knowledge, attitudes, skills, and behaviors support financial resilience, or could have supported financial resilience during that during that disaster recovery. Individuals with financial capability, knowledge, and skills were more resilient in disaster recovery. People identified those financial capability skills as budgeting, including things such as savings for unexpected or non-monthly expenses, developing an emergency plan, saving strategy, spending less than you earn. Another one of those financial capability skills was to assess and address risk management strategies to address potential incidences. And that included those with an understanding of insurance coverage and who communicated with their insurance agent prior to a disaster were better positioned to have conversations with their agent about insurance coverage following a disaster. Another component of that was insurance literacy, understanding and assessing your coverage, again, the relationship with that agent, and the skills to communicate with the agent and appraisers, including knowing the types of questions to ask. Individuals and families with self-advocacy skills we're better able to ask questions to understand the process of accessing those disaster recovery resources and finding appropriate resources to assist them in their recovery. So understanding and accessing recovery resources, for example, FEMA, knowing who to ask help from, knowing how to advocate for yourself, understanding the government programs, and the ability to deal with bureaucracy, that red tape piece again came up, and advocating for oneself. And that included things such as decision-making skills, information-seeking skills, who and where and ways to gather information, evaluation skills, and identifying those questions to ask, and just the process of being organized. Next slide, please. As a result, we've been looking at resources that are available to help and to be strategies, part of that strategy for families. And so one of those is to create and use a spending plan. So when we asked about the knowledge, skills, and behaviors to support financial resilience, people also identified strategies along with this. And that's what we're wanting to share with you here. So having a spending plan and using it and being able to adapt it to assess how income and expenses will change following a disaster and moving through recovery. Next slide. Another strategy that was identified was developing an emergency fund. We heard quite a bit during the government's shutdown in December that people may not have had $400 to $500 to maintain their situation during that government shutdown. Just think of as little as $400 to $500 can make a difference. And you hear that statistic often from America Saves, and CFPB, I think, identifies that as well in Your Money, Your Goals. And so just the idea of beginning to have something set aside for those unexpected situations. Another piece of that is also keeping some cash available at home. And because, again, as people identified, there may not be banks or ATMs available to them to gain cash if needed. Next slide. Another piece of this is reviewing a credit report. And it's important for individuals to know their credit score, to monitor their credit history, and understand whether or not they could take on additional credit if a disaster occurred. And also, if a person is not in a great place with their credit currently, understanding the steps to take in order to get there and to follow through with those actions so that they can then, in the future, be able to access credit if needed. Next slide, please. Another piece of that is determining the debt-to-income ratio, understanding if you can take on that new credit in an emergency. That includes identifying your current credit usage and understanding the ability to take on additional credit and having it be sustainable for you in the long term. Oftentimes we'll see in disaster recovery situations that people will make decisions, think that they have resources available to them in terms of credit, and later find that the decisions are unsustainable in the long term. And so identifying through the debt-to-income ratio helps you not only to look at your current usage, but your ability to take on additional credit if you needed to. And so the ratio there is identified as monthly debt divided by monthly income. Next slide, please. Another piece of this is developing a household inventory. How do you know what you have in your home? And so by developing this household inventory, you can provide proof of owning a possession, determine your insurance needs, and use the information following a disaster for insurance, potentially assistance, and taxes. And we've identified a couple of tools there for use in developing that household inventory. Another simple thing that often we identify for people to do is to just take pictures around the home and even a video on a cell phone, and to be talking about those items in your home so that at least you have some record of what was in your home. You know, it might be, oh, that's the television that we bought in 2012 or whatever it happens to be. But you can, in a video such as that, identify the items potentially when you purchase them. And then if you have those supporting materials to go along with it, the receipts and such, then you have the paperwork to follow through following a disaster. Next slide. Reviewing your insurance coverage then is another strategy to look at. What type of insurance do you need? Do you need homeowners or renters insurance? How about flood, health, vehicle insurance? And then understanding what is covered for each of those. I do a lot of renter education, and what I hear from people is that, you know, they assume that their personal property is protected by their property manager's insurance, and that is not the case. And think about what the cost of those personal property items might be, even something as simple as a cell phone and how much that costs. Then think on the larger term of all of the items that you might have and have to replace in your home, whether it be rented or whether it be the home that you own. And so there are a variety of insurance needs to look at. Another thing we often hear is people don't live in a floodplain, and they think that they are not eligible for flood insurance. And something we remind people is that you need to check and see if you are indeed eligible to purchase flood insurance. If your municipality participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, you can purchase flood insurance. And I know of some communities up in northern Minnesota where I am that when the large flood in 2012 came along, people thought that their community had indeed purchased or participated in the flood insurance program, and in fact they had not. So they assumed that they would be covered because they tried to purchase flood insurance and then later found out that their community had not participated. So it's important to know who to contact regarding those things. Find out in your municipality and then go to your insurance agent and to take a look at that as well. Okay, moving on. And lastly, we want to make sure that people have a grab and go file. And this is important, that you can have your important papers as well as other materials that you would like to take with you, ready to go if you should need to leave your home. And so national agencies that work with disasters recommend gathering important items in a file or a binder, storing it someplace where family members can grab it and go quickly if they need to. We want something that is easy to fit in a backpack or a small travel bag of some sort, and also keep it waterproof. So often we have these materials, but they're in a paper file, and we need to make sure that they're in a waterproof container in case there is water of some sort coming into the home. So we want to make sure that you have those materials such as your family contact information, your policy informations, your financial accounts, and photocopies of important papers. Perhaps it's the birth and marriage certificates, divorce decrees, social security cards, driver's license, other wallet cards that you might keep, passports, recent tax returns. There's a lot of information that could go into that grab and go file. And again, remember thinking about those replacing important papers. If there are some things that you think about related to a grab and go file that maybe you don't have right now, are there ones that need to be replaced or a copy gained from some source, and think about where those come from. You see we have the grab and go file emergency information on the slide and a link to that area. All right, passing back to Sarah now.
Thank you, Lori. There we go. Okay, so we want to have a chat again. Tell us about what resources you are aware of that are available to assist people to financially prepare for disaster. So what resources are available to assist in helping people financially prepare? Share your thoughts in the chat box. Think about what you might use if you would do education with folks in your community. Okay, extension programs, right? We often think of that. I wonder if people in our communities look towards extension. Eden resources, financial wellness programs, credit unions. So some of our financial institutions perhaps might be helping with that. Ready.gov, yeah, lots of great resources and information there. I'm going to give it just a few more seconds to see if others have ideas on resources available. All right, we're going to go to the next slide. So when we did our focus groups, we asked folks, where do people go to get information or assistance on getting their finances in order? And so they talked about community organizations, whether it was a nonprofit or a social service organization, maybe community leaders or even local businesses perhaps. That personal support, so friends, family, churches or places of worship were mentioned there as well. They identified social media and the internet as a place where folks might go to get financial information. Extension in Eden, so similar to Joyce, so you mentioned that as well. The financial institutions, someone came up with that as well. So banks and credit unions, financial planners, we grouped in attorneys, accountants, insurance agents, and insurance agents is our next item there as well. So working with those folks. Emergency response folks, so those were identified. Red Cross, emergency management, ready.gov, disaster recovery centers, safety.org. And then also traditional media. Some people look towards the television, the radio, newspapers for information. And then folks also identified employers as a possible source of information. But they also identified that oftentimes people don't know where to go. You know, as extension employees and helping professionals, we kind of have a handle on that. But I think our general population, folks in our communities, may not know where to go. So we also asked folks what resources are currently available to help survivors financially prepare for a disaster. So a similar list to what we had on the previous list. The government, non-government organizations down at the bottom, so they got really specific with Red Cross, FEMA, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, SBA, Ready.gov. So a variety of resources there that were identified. And then we took it a step further and we asked the focus group participants to tell us about what resources are meeting the needs, which are missing the mark, and what's missing altogether. And so meeting the needs, FEMA, insurance agents, extension, financial institutions, doonething.com, someone mentioned that, check that one out. Then when we asked about missing the mark, so they felt resources are lacking or not available. They may not be available in a desired format or platform. And resources may not be reaching underserved populations. And then when we asked them, what is missing altogether? So they identified that the need, basic financial literacy education should be accessible to all. Motivation to financially prepare was missing. An understanding of consequences of not preparing finances. And then resources and tools to assist reaching those hard to reach populations was on that missing altogether list. So we asked our participants again, well, what do good resources look like? And they said resources need to be simple, right? So maybe it's a simple sheet with bullets or a checklist or simple action plans or action steps. They're easy to accomplish sorts of things, and they should be visually appealing but not overwhelming, or if they're visual like a video, it shouldn't be jumpy and cause stress for folks. They also indicated that multiple delivery formats and tools are important. So trying to reach folks in a variety of ways. So they talked about social media, maybe podcasts, videos, apps, maybe asynchronous or on-demand online courses, maybe packets with fillable forms and instructions. They identify that face-to-face probably isn't a priority, or maybe online fillable resources, so multiple formats. They also talked about that good resources should be accessible for multiple languages and income levels. The bottom left-hand square there, the use of stories to connect with and motivate action was really important. And so storytelling is a good way to reach people. On the bottom in the middle, offering incentives to motivate preparedness actions. And this was really challenging. They did talk about perhaps working with organizations such as insurance companies to offer incentives for folks who take steps to become prepared. And then they also indicated that good resources find people, they get their attention, and they motivate them to action. Now, we know as extension professionals that's easier said than done, but that's our goal, right? We want to go beyond basic information. We want folks to move to the action piece. So again, with our focus groups, we asked them how to make resources accessible and utilized. And they talked about the timing of the resource delivery needs to be strategic. And they said definitely being able to build upon existing designated disaster or weather weeks or months, National Tornado Awareness Week or whatever, and then to allow adequate time for action. They talked about location, right? So location, 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 and resources need to be offered where people are receptive to receiving information. They talked about resource fairs and maybe places where people are spending time, right? And they have downtime, so laundromats or other places where folks might be able to take time to look at information. Organizations collaborate. My S fell to the second line there. But they talked about how it's really important for organizations to work together in order to maximize reach to a variety of audiences. They talked about the YMCA and financial institutions, insurance companies, places of worship, community leaders, disaster responders, Eden and VOAD, the voluntary organizations active in disaster, public libraries, law enforcement, and other government organizations. They again talked about incentives, and that one's a little more challenging, definitely, but they wondered if perhaps insurance companies, employers, financial institutions might be able to provide incentives. And then to accommodate diversity. Oh, my E fell off on that one as well. But being able to offer things in different languages as needed and to be culturally sensitive. So we also asked, are there issues of diversity that impact how individuals or families prepare their finances to be more resilient following a disaster? And they had some really intriguing responses on this and some really thought-provoking pieces. They indicate that a lot of our systems have barriers. Preparedness decisions and actions are oftentimes based on personal values. Each person is differently motivated, right? So when we think about incentives and motivating, it's not just a one-size-fits-all. They talked about us as helping professionals need to acknowledge that the ability to prepare is oftentimes a privilege. They indicated that higher socioeconomic status folks may be better positioned to take preparedness steps. Geography may affect preparedness. And then individuals who have trust issues with agencies who have failed them in the past are going to be challenged in being receptive to preparedness steps as well. So let's start thinking about some of those resources, and several people mentioned extension, right? So we have representation across the nation and in almost every county across the state, and so we do have reach. And this is actually Lori's slide, so I'm going to pass it back to you, Lori.
All right, that's fine. I was just going to highlight that several months ago, Sarah and I were asked to participate and present a webinar to AFCPE and to share some information around disaster preparedness, financial disaster preparedness resources. And part of that was sharing some resources that are compiled on a list. And Abby will share that with you by the end of the presentation today. But I was just going to share that, we certainly identified extension as a resource in all states, and that there are resources available for everyone to access across extension across the country. And so that's what we wanted to highlight here. Just a few more of these resources than that we shared in that presentation. Sarah, next slide, please. Eden was another resource that we certainly wanted to share with the group as we did that presentation. And again, you will see that on the disaster preparedness resource handout that Abby has just uploaded to the chat. Thank you so much. And so we wanted to make sure that people were aware of you out there as professionals in experienced in disaster education. Okay, next slide. We also identified some specific resources that we were aware of related to extension resources. Here you see our University of Minnesota Disaster Preparation and Recovery website, and identified some others as well. And just make sure to take a look at that handout and keep it handy for your own use. Next slide, please. And FEMA, of course, the EFAC, the federal, the Emergency Financial First Aid Kit, and we've identified that as well. Certainly an important piece to keep handy, and we know that there's some good resources for household inventory and such in that resource as well. And reminding all of you that AFCPE does have financial counselors available across the country, and that there may be financial counselors near you that may be a resource for you as well to tap into as people are experiencing disaster, and hopefully also preparing so that they are not needing to deal with the results of the disaster, but rather feel prepared going into any disasters that should come along. Some other resources that we have on the handout for you are some financial institutions, and identifying, who that you need to talk to those individuals. Also the insurance agents, thinking about your local nonprofits, and city and county emergency management. As we said in our focus group interviews, we had people that identified faith-based organizations and other organizations. And so we want you to take a good look at that disaster preparedness resource list and to utilize that however you may find useful. And so we just have a couple of more questions for you here. we would like to know, after seeing these resources and some of the information from our focus groups, what do you believe are financial preparedness resources that are still needed? We've given you some of the comments that our participants have found and have identified to us. We want to know if you see missing resources. And again, perhaps there are some things that are there but need to be highlighted a little bit more, things like that. So what are still needed in the realm of financial preparedness resources? If you have thoughts, please put those in the chat pod. And as you're thinking about those, we certainly are welcome to having you contact us. If you think about something, you know, I'm a true introvert, and I say that I will think about this after I leave here today and may come up with something that I thought, boy, that was brilliant, I should have shared it. And so please feel free that you can contact Sarah and myself and let us know if you think of other things along the way that you would like to share. We're certainly happy to do that. Thank you, Joyce, who said best practices for motivating people to take action. Yeah, that's one thing that we've been looking at. Sarah mentioned earlier the do one thing, you know, breaking things down into very concrete pieces that people can take action on. Maybe I can't do a whole list of things in a home inventory right now, but maybe I can do just one item out of it. And that's one thing I don't have to do in the future. It's done. And so those practices are important. Yeah, and even Hurricane Harvey wasn't motivation for some. She says, okay, yeah, I like the idea of just doing one thing, because when I look at whatever the task is at home, sometimes there are things that are just so overwhelming. If I could do one piece, it's a good thing. Thanks for sharing that. And again, if you have others, please feel free to let us know as we go forward.
So now this is our final question, I believe. We wanted to have a discussion about ideas for implementing financial preparedness programming in your state. You know, share what you're currently doing, share what you hope to do, because definitely we know perhaps we can have better impact with folks if we work on the preparedness side as opposed to the response and recovery side. So what are some ideas that you hope to do or that you're currently doing? Or what do you wish your extension program could hire someone to do? Because I know so many of us have such limited time. You know, we're already doing multiple programs. Maybe we don't have a budget. So if you were to have unlimited time and resources, what would you like to do? It's a tough question, right? Especially since many of us have our plans of work already done. Joyce is asking, has anyone done any short videos interviewing people who have been impacted to talk about what they wished they had done? That's a great idea. In Minnesota, we worked with NDSU, so with Lori Sharmer in North Dakota before she retired, to have our recovery after disaster video series. And that was from a recovery standpoint, but we had many survivors who gave testimonials and shared their stories about, oh, I wish I had. So reworking those might be an opportunity. Connie shared that one of our regional co-ads are working with their community, helping those who can't develop a complete kit to do it monthly. So are you talking like a grab and go kit, maybe organizing their papers, some of that? Okay, that's a great idea. Yes, thank you, Connie. Well, we are definitely interested in talking with folks and working with folks. If we come up with some ideas, and I really like your best practices for motivating people to take action, Joyce. definitely give a shout out to Lori or I. We would love to collaborate with people. Joyce, yes, that's a great idea for our limited income families who can't afford to purchase everything at once with putting together the kits. Yep, it's one step closer to getting organized. Well, we are going to end our piece of this and hand it back to Noel as he finishes off the webinar. But again, please reach out to Lori and I. We don't have all the answers. We know there are a lot of needs out there, so we welcome those conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah and Lori, for this very engaging and informative presentation. We will go ahead and take some questions at this time. Just a reminder, please be sure to type your questions into the chat box in your control panel. Any questions for Sarah and Lori? While we wait questions, I have one question. What was the demographics for your focus group?
So I'll respond to that. We had disaster professionals, we had disaster survivors, and volunteers across the country. As far as age, race, gender, I don't have that in front of me right now, but we do have that information. We could pull that information together, I believe, for.
And I asked that question particularly with regards to age, because you know, it'll be interesting to find out the difference in opinions from the younger population.
Off the top of my head, I would say they were middle-aged primarily, and we did have a few younger individuals, young professionals. I remember a few that in their 20s, maybe early 30s.
And of the 66 that registered to participate, and granted we had 27 of the 66 that registered, we had quite a variety, as Lori talked, disaster survivors, disaster professionals, and those professionals represented a variety of agencies, including Extension, other universities, the SBA, initiative fund staff, emergency managers, disaster recovery nonprofit organizations, LSS, volunteer fire departments, public health, city, county, and state emergency services, Red Cross, Operation Hope, and religious relief organizations.
Okay.
Sarah, I'm so glad you had that in front of you.
Well, and yeah, I pulled Lori out of a training today. She's supposed to be teaching, but so she had to join over here. So yes, I had that, Lori. You're welcome.
Any questions from our participants?
Well, I see that Connie put a comment that FEMA Region 7 is working on financial resiliency. So please forward that information. What you're going to share this information with them. I would love to connect with them as well. So if you have any contact information, or we can try to track them down. And yes, Abby shared a PDF of the slides. So yes, I'm going to make note to connect with Region 7. Thank you, Connie. And connected to that as well, Connie, AFCP, the Association for Financial Counseling and Planning Education, has formed a partnership with FEMA to address financial literacy, financial preparedness efforts. So I'm guessing and wondering that Region 7's efforts might be part of all of that. So there's some momentum happening among organizations.
as we wait for questions, I also now recall there were a few instances here, especially after Ike. We had a number of disasters kind of back to back here in Southeast Texas. And so it speaks a lot to the importance of this financial preparedness, because we had a few people who had not recovered in terms of rebuilding from some of the disasters when, for instance, Harvey hit. And so the funding they received, for example, from FEMA was not enough to cover the damage already. And here comes another disaster. What help or advice would you give for persons in those type of situations?
That's really challenging, right? So not only were they devastated once by a disaster, then they're hit again, and yeah, definitely we would want to wrap or connect folks with a wide variety of community services. And as folks know, when we talk disasters, the resources and assistance on if disasters are federally declared and how they're federally declared. So yeah, we would want to look for as many resources as possible, because it's really like putting a puzzle together to try to meet those needs and those unmet needs.
Yes. As we wait for any other questions or comments, Abby has placed the link to the evaluation for today's webinar in the chat box. We want to invite participation. Your input is extremely important to us determining topics to offer. We would like to offer topics that our participants are interested in hearing. And so we invite your participation in the survey. We have another comment here. Joy said, Connie said one of the issues for our flooding communities is the lack of flood insurance. Many times it's too expensive. And then Joyce added, and most people don't understand the nature of FEMA assistance and are upset when they learn it is mostly in the form of low interest loans. This identifies the need for a resource explaining the process and the types of assistance, and that is true. Any comments to that, Sarah and Lori?
Yeah, I was just going to say, and this kind of relates back to the previous comments too, thinking about in 2012 when my area, northeastern Minnesota, experienced a flood that was, the 100-year flood. It was never supposed to happen because of the elevation of the area and those types of things. We saw that people didn't necessarily report, oh, I'm okay, but my neighbor isn't. My neighbor is the one that needs help. The more that we can help people to understand the importance of reporting their damage, the more that there is potential for those resources to come in the form of individual and household assistance. And I think too often people, are of the mentality that we can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. I'm okay, I can handle it. And if they report and let people know how bad the damage is, then there's more potential for that assistance to come their way. So that's one of the things. As far as, yes, we certainly need resources to help people understand. I think probably the difficulty with that is, as with so many things in financial education, we say it depends, because there are so many moving parts in disaster recovery to understand. So it's so variable sometimes, and again, dependent on the type of disaster as well.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're right at 2 o'clock on it, Central, 3 o'clock Eastern. It looks like we've covered all the questions. Sarah, Laurie, is there anything else you want to just speak to before we wrap up?
We would just love to have conversations with folks if they are interested in collaborating or to discuss more what types of resources are needed or how to take the existing resources and just get them out to folks in a usable way and that whole motivation piece. So we invite conversations. Thank you so much.
Well, great. And thank you, Sarah and Laurie, for being our presenters today. I know I speak on behalf of everyone. And thank you, everyone. We appreciate you being here with us today on the Eden webinar. As a reminder, this webinar will be archived on the Eden YouTube channel and distributed through the listserv. Please mark your calendars for a special edition Eden webinar on Tuesday, July 9th at 2 p.m. Eastern, when representatives from the Emergency Support Function, or ESF-11 National Coordination Team, and USDA APHIS will present on what ESF-11 is and how Eden should be engaged as a listed supported agency. Registration information for that webinar will be shared in the coming days. Check your email for information. Thanks again for joining us today, and we will see you next time. Bye, everyone.